Hello. I would like to read to you chapter 6 from the book Stuff, subtitled The Fortunes, Foibles, and Fiascos of Those Who Sought to Understand Matter. Chapter 6 is subtitled The First Guinea Pig Was a Guinea Pig. I think this might be my favorite chapter. The story of the chemist couple, Marie and Antoine Lavoisier, is just so filled with drama and tragedy, romance, everything. They were just and incredible achievements in chemistry. The Frenchman, Antoine Lavoisier, is sometimes called the father of modern chemistry, especially by Frenchmen. If Antoine deserves that title, then his wife, Marie, definitely should be called the mother of modern chemistry. They never had any children, just chemistry. Look at this picture of them. Does this look like a picture of what were probably the two top chemists in the world at the time the picture was painted? I mean, look at them. What are they? What are they talking about? I don't want to suggest what words they're exchanging here. I don't think YouTube would let me publish it. The Lavoisiers made important discoveries in the late 1700s. At that time, chemistry was pretty much a rich person's hobby. Since you had to be both rich and interested in chemistry to get into chemical research, it's easy to see why the understanding of the nature of matter was moving so slowly. You didn't even have to be smart to be a chemist, which may explain a lot of the dumb ideas that people had about matter. But Antoine and Marie were very smart. Both Lavoisiers were born filthy rich, and they were both members of the French aristocracy. Today we would say they were members of the top 1%. Antoine's father was a rich lawyer, so he became a lawyer too, even though he was more interested in science. He never practiced law, but instead got a job collecting taxes. In those days, the king paid Antoine's company to collect taxes for him. The company gave the king a lot of the collected tax money and then collected a lot more tax money that it kept. This worked out well for everyone except the people being taxed. Lavoisier thought that people were getting ripped off and tried to change the system to make things easier for poor people, but no one paid much attention. In his spare time, Antoine set up a lab and did chemistry experiments. How Marie got involved is the most interesting part of their story. Her father, Jacques Coulson, was one of Antoine's bosses. When she was 13, a count who was even richer and more powerful than Jacques said he was going to marry Marie. The rich guy was 3 times her age. She didn't like him, her father didn't like him, and so they said no. The count threatened to get Jacques fired if he couldn't marry his daughter. Jacques thought fast and said, she can't marry you because she's engaged to this young guy, Antoine, who works for me. The next day, Jacques pulled Antoine aside and said, Antoine, my boy, I have a little favor to ask of you. So at age 28, Lavoisier married the boss's 13-year-old daughter. They hit it off immediately. Marie thought chemistry was really interesting and wanted to help. She studied chemistry from the leading French chemists of the day. She studied art under famous artists so that she could make drawings of experimental apparatus for Antoine's chemistry articles. She learned English so that she could translate the writing of English chemists into French for Antoine. When she translated an article, she also pointed out any mistakes in the author's experimental procedure and conclusions. Some historians give Antoine all the credit for his discoveries, but others think Marie deserves just as much credit. There was a reason Antoine and Marie were running rings around other chemists in the late 1700s. They took very careful measurements, especially of mass, volume, and temperature. Marie took detailed notes describing their experimental procedures and made precise drawings of their apparatus. Anyone who doubted the results had all the information they needed to repeat their experiments. This was a big step forward for chemistry, and it added some key pieces to the puzzle of whether or not atoms existed. Marie drew this picture of herself taking notes while Antoine and his pals fool around in the lab. The Lavoisiers corrected the dumb idea people had about what happens when things burn. It was thought that flammable materials contained something called phlogiston, which was released during combustion. No one ever explained where the mysterious stuff went or even exactly what it was. The Lavoisiers showed that things burned when they reacted with the gas in the air, and that there was no such thing as phlogiston. Antoine named the gas oxygen and said correctly that it was an element. They also showed that this was the same gas that reacted more slowly with metals and some other elements. Mercury is a metal that reacts with oxygen to form mercuric oxide. The Lavoisier's two careful measurements showed that when this reaction took place in a closed container, about 20% of the air in the container was used up. When they reversed the reaction, the missing air reappeared. They concluded correctly that this meant that air was a mixture of 20% oxygen and 80% of other gas. The other element we now call nitrogen. So air, one of the 4 classic elements on the ancient list, was not an element, but a mixture. They also crossed water off the list of classic elements by showing it could be decomposed into 2 gases, oxygen and another element they named hydrogen. In fact, as we already said, none of the classic elements, earth, fire, air, and water, are really elements. It occurred to Antoine that burning carbon was very much like respiration or breathing. They both produced heat and carbon dioxide. He wanted to see if the ratio of heat to CO2 was the same for both processes. He couldn't very well use a human for the experiment because he would have to confine the breather to a sealed container. He said, "Marie, we need a guinea pig for this experiment, but we can't use a human. Do you have any ideas?" Marie said, "Well, Antoine, why don't you use a guinea pig for the guinea pig?" Good idea. Why didn't I think of that? So the first guinea pig was a guinea pig. They measured the amount of heat the furry little guy gave off and how much CO2 he exhaled. Then they burned carbon until they had the same amount of CO2, and voila, as they say in France, the burning carbon had produced the same amount of heat as the guinea pig. They had shown that animals, us included, are fueled by a form of combustion. This guinea pig is worrying about his role in an experiment. In 1789, Antoine published a book that is considered to be the first chemistry textbook. Marie did a great job drawing all the pictures. The title, translated into English, is Elementary Treatise on Chemistry. It included what he had learned about oxygen and listed all the other materials he considered to be elements. Most of them were, and none of the classic elements made the list. He introduced a system of naming chemical compounds that made a lot more sense than the one being used. For example, the compound Lavoisier called copper sulfate had previously been called vitriol of Venus. The book included a clear statement of the law of conservation of mass. One way to say this is that The mass of the products of a chemical reaction is always the same as the mass of the reactants. Reactants and products are the terms for the stuff before and the stuff after a reaction. As Antoine put it, nothing is created, nothing is destroyed, everything changes. He also made a clear distinction between elements and compounds by defining elements as materials that cannot be further broken down by chemical processes. This law and this definition turned out to be two more keys to answering the question, is stuff made out of atoms or is it continuous? For some reason, Lavoisier did not believe in atoms. Here's a picture of one of the illustrations Marie drew for Antoine's chemistry book. Antoine had other accomplishments. He was largely responsible for switching France to the metric system of measurements. He also invented a new kind of plaster. Guess what it was called? Of course, plaster of Paris. Soon after the American Revolution, France had its own revolution. The two revolutions were kind of similar because people in both places were fed up with the king, and the result was more democracy. The Lavoisiers were fairly liberal for rich people. They thought the country needed some changes and helped with some reforms. They didn't want a big fight. They wanted to work with the rulers and change the system from the inside. Most French people were much too angry and impatient for that kind of gradual change. In 1793, things turned nasty and a lot of people were executed, starting with the king and queen. Condemned people had their heads cut off with a machine called a guillotine. We won't include a picture of this, it's just too gross. Anyone connected to the old government was subjected to being against the revolution. Former tax collectors were in especially deep doo-doo. In 1794, Antoine was hauled into court with the rest of the tax collectors. It didn't matter that he had tried to ease the tax burden on poor people when he had the job. He was still found guilty. Marie defended him during the trial, but it was hopeless. Trials were quick, and no one was getting off. There is a story, probably not true, that Antoine wanted to do one last experiment. He told a friend that he wanted to see how long a person remained conscious after his head was no longer connected to his body. He said to the friend, "When the blade drops, I'm going to start blinking. You count how many times I blink after my head is cut off." The counts vary. Some say as many as 30. Marie was allowed to keep her head, but the government took all the chemistry apparatus and all her lab books. A year later, a big package arrived at her door. It contained almost everything that had been taken, along with a note that said, "To the widow of Lavoisier, who was falsely convicted." Better than nothing, I guess. Here's a portrait of Marie Lavoisier, missing Antoine. Marie continued her interest in science. She often hosted gatherings where well-known chemists and physicists exchanged ideas. These were called salons, which is kind of a party that consists of mostly talking. She also started dating. One famous man who hoped to hook up with Marie was named Pierre Dupont. One of Pierre's sons moved to America and founded the huge DuPont chemical company. Marie eventually told him to buzz off. She did finally get married again to a physicist who called himself Count Rumford. His real name was Benjamin Thompson. Rumford was just the name of the town in New Hampshire where he had once lived. The so-called Count was a brilliant physicist but a lousy husband. He had fled to Europe after he was caught spying for the British during the American Revolution. He also fled his first wife, whom he probably married for her money. He may have found Marie attractive for the same reason. In any case, they fought constantly and broke up in a few months. Marie's amazing life ended at the age of 78 in 1836. Thanks to the Lavoisiers, belief in atoms was about to make a big comeback. All that was needed was one more clue for someone to perform a brilliant feat of logic. And that's the end of Chapter 6. Chapter 7, coming soon, is entitled John Dalton, or Revenge of the Atomists. If you want to see the book, scroll down on the YouTube page. First you have to reduce the screen from full screen to be able to scroll down, and you'll see a link to a place where you can look into the book, buy the book, read the reviews, and so forth. If you want to subscribe to this YouTube channel, click on the subscribe button down, I think it should be down in the lower right hand corner. I can't see it, but I hope you can. So that's all for today, and thanks for listening. Bye.